They arrested her for stealing $12 million. The evidence was perfect. The timestamps matched. The login credentials were hers. Case closed, right? But at the exact second the money was transferred, she was standing under bright lights next to a billionaire, with cameras rolling. Someone planned the perfect frame job and forgot one thing: time. If you love shocking true stories of power, betrayal, and justice, hit like, subscribe, and let's uncover what really happened. The first thing Elena Ramirez heard was her name being shouted across the trading floor. She looked up from her screen, confused, just as two federal agents walked through the glass doors of Harlow and Pierce Investments. Conversations died instantly. Keyboards stopped clacking. Someone dropped a coffee mug. "Elena Ramirez?" one agent asked, already knowing the answer. She stood slowly. "Yes." The badge flashed. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and embezzlement totaling $12 million. The words didn't register at first. $12 million? Her coworkers stared at her like she'd just revealed a second face. "There has to be a mistake," she said calmly, because panic would only make this worse. But the agents were already turning her around, cold metal cuffs snapping tight around her wrists. Across the room, her boss Marcus Hale stepped out of his office, face arranged in perfect shock. "What's going on?" he demanded, performing concern. The lead agent spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Funds were transferred from company reserves into offshore accounts using Ms. Ramirez's credentials. The transfers occurred 3 nights ago at 9:47 p.m. from her assigned terminal. Gasps rippled. Elena's mind raced. 3 nights ago? That was Saturday. She hadn't been near the building Saturday night. She'd been in a ballroom filled with cameras, donors, and one of the most powerful men in the country. "Check your timestamps," she said quietly. "I wasn't even here." But Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough. "Elena, if there's something you need to tell me." It sounded supportive. It wasn't. It was surgical. She looked at him, confused at the faint flicker in his eyes. Satisfaction. As she was escorted past rows of coworkers who once admired her discipline and integrity, screens began lighting up with breaking news alerts. Federal analyst accused of multi-million-dollar fraud. Her face was already online. Reputation destroyed in under 5 minutes. Outside, cameras had gathered as if they'd been tipped off. Someone had known this was coming. As the car door shut and the world narrowed to tinted glass and suffocating silence, only one thought cut through her shock. This was planned. And somewhere above the chaos, in a quiet executive office with the blinds partially drawn, Marcus Hale closed his door, walked to his desk, and allowed himself a single slow smile. He believed he had just removed the only person who could expose him. He believed the digital trail was flawless. He believed no one could prove where Elena truly was at 9:47 p.m. He was wrong. Marcus Hale had not built his career on luck. He built it on precision. For 2 years, he had been siphoning small percentages from internal liquidity movements, disguising them as strategic reallocations between subsidiary accounts. Numbers so minor they blended into quarterly noise. Until Elena started asking questions. She was the only analyst who read footnotes twice. The only one who cross-checked minor variances against long-term projections. 3 weeks ago, she had requested access to archived transaction logs from an internal reserve account Marcus controlled. That request was the moment he decided she couldn't stay. He didn't panic. He engineered. First, he cloned her authentication pattern during a routine IT update. Then, he created mirrored credentials that would activate only through the executive VPN cluster. He studied her work habits, her login times, even the cadence of her keystrokes to replicate digital behavior. Saturday night was perfect. The office would be empty. IT monitoring minimal. At exactly 9:47 p.m., he sat in his private executive office, logged into the override terminal, and initiated 12 separate transfers totaling $12 million into layered offshore shells he had quietly established 18 months earlier. The transfers were routed through Elena's credentials, bounced through encrypted IP masking, and sealed with her digital signature. He even triggered a delayed anonymous compliance alert to ensure investigators would discover the fraud quickly. By Monday morning, the narrative would write itself. Ambitious analyst schemes millions. But Marcus made one assumption. He assumed Elena would be home that night, alone, unaccounted for. He did not check her calendar. He did not notice the invitation she had accepted weeks earlier. At 9:47 p.m., while he executed what he believed was a perfect crime, Elena was standing beneath crystal chandeliers at the Vaughn Foundation annual gala, speaking about financial literacy to a room of senators, CEOs, and journalists. And seated at the head table beside her was Daniel Vaughn, billionaire founder of the cybersecurity empire that protected half the Fortune 500. Marcus believed digital evidence was untouchable. He forgot that sometimes the strongest proof isn't hidden in code. It's standing under stage lights. Daniel Vaughn did not attend events casually. He observed everything. He remembered details most people forgot within seconds. The night of the gala, he had personally invited Elena after reviewing a scholarship report she helped design. He admired competence. During dinner, they discussed market volatility, ethical investing, and corporate transparency. At 9:32 p.m., she laughed at a joke about venture capitalists. At 9:41 p.m., she checked her phone briefly when a colleague texted about Monday's meeting. At 9:47 p.m., precisely 9:47, she was standing at the podium delivering a speech about accountability and financial leadership. Vaughn remembered the timestamp because his company's event security system watermarked every second of footage using atomic clock synchronization. It was his technology. When news broke 2 days later accusing her of committing fraud at that exact minute, he didn't react with confusion. He reacted with calculation. He replayed the archived footage himself. There she was. Clear. Continuous. Impossible to dispute. Yet prosecutors were confident. They claimed login credentials don't lie. IP addresses don't lie. Multi-factor authentication doesn't lie. Vaughn leaned back in his chair and murmured, "Systems don't lie. People inside them do." Within an hour, he had assembled his legal counsel and head of cybersecurity. "I want every second of Saturday night preserved," he said. "And I want an independent forensic team reviewing the firm's VPN architecture." He had no emotional investment in Elena. Not yet. What he had was a deep intolerance for manipulation. If someone had used his own event, his own time-stamped environment, as accidental cover for a crime, he intended to dismantle them methodically. Meanwhile, Marcus watched the news cycle shifting from outrage to curiosity. Why would a woman bold enough to steal $12 million appear at a public gala surrounded by cameras? Why commit fraud in the middle of a televised speech? Doubt was forming. Marcus told himself it would fade. Digital logs were stronger than memory, stronger than witnesses, stronger than charisma. But he did not account for one variable, the billionaire whose entire empire was built on proving digital systems can be exploited from the inside. And Daniel Vaughn had just decided to look very, very closely. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting. Prosecutors moved first, confident, methodical, projecting enlarged screenshots of transaction logs onto a massive screen for the judge and jury. At 9:47 p.m., the lead prosecutor said, "Laser pointer steady." The defendant accessed a restricted reserve account using her credentials. 12 transfers were executed within 4 minutes. Multi-factor authentication confirmed identity. The IP address traces back to the company's executive network. It looked devastating. Elena sat still, hands folded, the weight of public humiliation pressing against her ribs. Marcus sat behind the prosecution table as a cooperating executive witness, expression carefully neutral. Then Daniel Vaughn's legal team stood. They didn't argue. They requested permission to display synchronized footage. The screen split in two. On the left, the company's digital timestamp showing 9:47 p.m. On the right, ultra-high-definition video from the Vaughn Foundation Gala, watermarked with atomic clock precision down to the millisecond. At exactly 9:47 and 12 seconds p.m., Elena Ramirez was clearly visible beneath stage lighting, speaking into a microphone about ethical transparency in financial systems. The courtroom shifted. Jurors leaned forward. The prosecutor frowned. "Video can be edited," he attempted. Vaughn's lead attorney didn't flinch. This footage is secured through a blockchain-based verification protocol developed by Mr. Vaughn's company. Any alteration would create a visible break in cryptographic continuity. There is none. A technician confirmed it under oath. Continuous recording. No gaps. No tampering. The judge's expression hardened. So either the defendant possesses the ability to be in two places simultaneously, Vaughn's attorney said calmly, or someone executed these transfers remotely while deliberately using her credentials. The word deliberately hung in the air. Marcus felt something shift for the first time since the arrest. It wasn't panic yet. It was pressure. Because if Elena was provably at that gala, then someone inside Harlow and Pierce had staged the digital trail. And only a handful of people had the authority to override executive-level VPN protocols on a Saturday night. Daniel Vaughn did not rely on courtroom theatrics. While public opinion began tilting in Elena's favor, he quietly funded an independent cyberforensics investigation staffed by former federal analysts and ethical hackers who specialized in corporate intrusion mapping. They requested full backend access to Harlow and Pierce's network architecture. Reluctantly, under court order, the company complied. What they found wasn't flashy. It was subtle. The IP address used in the transfer did originate from the executive VPN cluster, just as prosecutors claimed. But deeper inspection revealed a manual override sequence embedded in the authentication chain. That sequence bypassed Elena's normal user pathway and rerouted through a secondary administrative terminal before returning to her credentials. In simple terms, someone with executive privileges had piggybacked on her digital identity. Only 3 employees possessed that level of clearance. The CEO, who was in Zurich that weekend with passport stamps to prove it. The head of IT, whose access logs showed he was offline and out of state. And Marcus Hale. When investigators examined physical server room access logs, they found something else. At 9:31 p.m. Saturday night, 16 minutes before the transfers, a batch activated the executive elevator to the restricted floor where the override terminal was located. The badge ID belonged to Marcus Hale. When questioned informally, Marcus smiled thinly. "I stopped by briefly to grab documents before dinner," he said. "I didn't log into anything." But forensic timestamps told a different story. At 9:33 p.m., the executive override console was activated. At 9:46 p.m., Elena's credentials were triggered from that console. At 9:47 p.m., the first transfer executed. The alignment was too precise to dismiss. When confronted with this alignment in a private deposition, Marcus pivoted instantly. "Then someone cloned my badge," he replied. "If Elena's credentials were compromised, mine could have been too." It sounded plausible, sophisticated, just enough doubt to keep himself afloat. But doubt works both ways. And now the doubt was circling him. The media narrative flipped faster than Marcus anticipated. Headlines that once declared Elena Ramirez corporate thief began asking a new question. Who framed the analyst? Financial commentators dissected VPN architecture on live television. Cybersecurity experts weighed in, explaining how internal actors often exploit privileged access to simulate external breaches. Marcus went on record claiming the firm itself had been hacked by unknown actors targeting executive credentials. He positioned himself as another victim. Calm. Cooperative. Outraged at the breach. But Daniel Vaughn was not finished. He subpoenaed full building security footage from that Saturday night, not just badge swipes but parking garage entries, hallway cameras, and biometric access scanners installed the previous year after a minor compliance incident. At 9:12 p.m., Marcus's car entered the underground garage. At 9:29 p.m., camera footage showed him stepping into the executive elevator alone. At 10:18 p.m., he exited carrying nothing but his phone. There was no sign of forced entry. No unidentified individuals. No evidence of cloned access cards. The timeline tightened like a vice. During the next court session, Vaughn's attorney played the synchronized sequence: garage entry, elevator ascent, console activation, fund transfer, elevator descent. The prosecutor's earlier confidence began to erode visibly. Marcus's jaw tightened as the judge asked a single question. "Mr. Hale, why did you state under oath that you were home all evening?" For the first time since Elena's arrest, Marcus hesitated before answering. And hesitation, in a courtroom built on precision timestamps and synchronized footage, was louder than any confession. Marcus Hale had built his reputation on composure, and for years that composure had been unshakable. Investors trusted him because he never sweated under pressure. Boards admired him because he always had an answer before the question fully formed. But inside the federal courtroom, with synchronized timestamps looping across two massive screens and the judge's gaze fixed squarely on him, the calm began to fracture. "Mr. Hale," the judge repeated evenly, "why did you testify that you were home the entire evening of Saturday, March 14th? Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, a habit he used to buy seconds. "Your Honor, I misspoke. I stopped by the office briefly, but it slipped my mind during questioning. It was insignificant." Insignificant. The word echoed. Vaughn's attorney stepped forward without raising his voice. "Insignificant, Mr. Hale? You accessed a restricted executive floor 16 minutes before $12 million was transferred using an override console routed through the defendant's credentials. That is not insignificant." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom gallery. Marcus held his expression steady. Correlation is not causation. It was a good line. He'd used it in boardrooms before. But this wasn't a boardroom. Vaughn's legal team introduced another layer. Internal messaging metadata from Marcus's company-issued phone showed that at 8:58 p.m., less than 15 minutes before he entered the building, he had received an automated alert from internal compliance systems indicating Elena had requested archived reserve account logs earlier that week. Elena, seated beside her attorney, felt her stomach tighten. She had requested those logs. She remembered the subtle tension in Marcus's voice when she'd mentioned discrepancies. "Isn't it true," Vaughn's attorney continued, "that Ms. Ramirez was conducting an internal review of reserve transfers that would have revealed unauthorized reallocations?" Marcus's jaw flexed. "She was performing routine analysis." "Routine analysis," the attorney replied, "that coincidentally aligned with your visit to the office on a Saturday night and the immediate redirection of $12 million into layered offshore accounts." The prosecution, sensing the shift, requested a recess. The judge granted 10 minutes. Cameras outside the courthouse exploded with speculation. Inside a private consultation room, Marcus's defense attorney spoke in low, urgent tones. "They're building motive. If they tie financial benefit directly to you, this becomes catastrophic." Marcus exhaled slowly. "They won't find it." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. He had been careful but not invisible. Shell corporations masked ownership, layered trusts blurred control, but money leaves patterns. It always leaves patterns. When court resumed, Vaughn's team introduced preliminary findings from forensic accountants. The $12 million had not vanished randomly. It had moved through 3 Cayman entities before landing in a venture capital startup specializing in predictive market analytics. A startup that, through intermediaries, traced back to a holding trust. A trust whose silent beneficiary was Marcus Hale. The room shifted palpably. Elena felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Momentum. The judge ordered full disclosure of the financial structures tied to the venture. Marcus's face remained composed, but a thin sheen of sweat formed at his temples. He had anticipated scrutiny. He had not anticipated a billionaire personally financing an audit deep enough to untangle offshore layers designed by elite tax architects. As proceedings adjourned for the day, reporters shouted questions about conflict of interest and executive fraud. Marcus walked past them without answering, but the narrative had changed. No longer was this a story about an ambitious analyst stealing from her firm. It was now a story about whether a powerful executive had weaponized corporate infrastructure to eliminate the one employee who noticed missing money. And for the first time, Marcus realized that framing Elena had not erased suspicion. It had redirected a spotlight directly onto himself. Forensic accounting is less dramatic than courtroom confrontation, but far more lethal. Over the next 2 weeks, Teams of analysts dissected years of transaction data from Harlow and Pierce. They weren't just looking at the $12 million transferred that Saturday night. They were scanning patterns, rounding anomalies, timing consistencies, repeated vendor codes attached to seemingly unrelated reallocations. What emerged was a slow, methodical siphoning stretching back 26 months. Small amounts. 200,000 here. 350,000 there. Always embedded within legitimate reserve movements, so they blended into quarterly reporting noise. The total exceeded $18 million before the final $12 million extraction attempt. $30 million in quiet diversion. Elena watched summaries unfold with a mixture of anger and vindication. She had sensed irregularities, but never imagined the scale. Marcus had not acted impulsively. He had engineered a parallel revenue stream hidden beneath corporate complexity. The venture capital startup receiving the offshore funds suddenly came under intense scrutiny. Public records showed aggressive investments in algorithmic trading software. Marketing materials boasted proprietary predictive models capable of outperforming institutional benchmarks. But deeper examination revealed the startup had minimal staff and no proven product. It was a shell-to-warehouse redirected capital until Marcus could legitimize it through acquisition or merger. During deposition, Marcus maintained that the trust structure linking him to the startup was for diversified retirement planning and that he had no operational control. But digital correspondence retrieved under warrant showed encrypted emails between Marcus and the startup's listed director discussing liquidity timing and accelerating the final transfer before Q2 disclosures. That phrase, accelerating the final transfer, became pivotal. It suggested urgency. Why urgency? Because Elena's audit request had landed on his desk. Prosecutors began constructing a clear timeline. Elena requests archived reserve logs. Marcus receives compliance alert. Within days, he executes the largest single diversion yet and routes it through her credentials, triggering internal detection to frame her before she could escalate findings. It wasn't just financial misconduct anymore. It was obstruction and retaliatory framing. Public opinion hardened swiftly. News segments featured cybersecurity experts explaining how insider threats account for the majority of corporate financial breaches. Commentators dissected executive privilege and the dangers of unchecked authority within financial institutions. Elena, once the villain, became the symbol of whistleblower vulnerability. She remained quiet publicly, advised by counsel, but internally the emotional weight was complex. Being proven innocent did not erase the image of her in handcuffs circulating endlessly online. It did not erase neighbors whispering or former colleagues avoiding eye contact. Vindication and trauma coexisted. Meanwhile, Marcus's investors began distancing themselves. Board members called emergency meetings. His access privileges within the firm were suspended pending investigation. The empire he had carefully climbed toward was destabilizing under the very transparency he once praised in earnings calls. When federal prosecutors formally expanded the case to include wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and perjury, the shift became irreversible. Marcus was no longer a witness. He was a target, and targets rarely control outcomes. The arrest happened on a gray Thursday morning, almost exactly 6 weeks after Elena's. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Federal agents entered Harlow and Pierce again, this time heading straight for the executive suite. Employees who had once watched Elena led away in disbelief now watched in silence as Marcus Hale was escorted out, wrists secured, expression rigid. There were no performative questions this time. No feigned confusion. The charges were read clearly. Multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and perjury under oath. Outside, cameras captured the image that would define the scandal, a former COO stepping into a federal vehicle while reporters shouted about shell corporations and falsified credentials. Elena observed from her attorney's office across town via live broadcast. She didn't celebrate. She exhaled. The legal reversal was powerful, but the emotional damage lingered. Her career had been paused mid-stride. Her reputation had been publicly dismantled before being slowly reconstructed. Justice moved forward, but scars remained. In custody, Marcus attempted one final strategy. Through counsel, he floated the possibility of a plea deal contingent upon providing additional context, implicating Elena as a willing participant. It was a desperate maneuver designed to regain leverage. But prosecutors, armed with synchronized footage, financial trails, encrypted communications, and false testimony transcripts, had little incentive to negotiate broadly. They offered reduced sentencing only in exchange for full restitution disclosure and cooperation against any external collaborators. There were none. This had been Marcus alone. The board of Harlow and Pierce issued a public apology to Elena and announced internal governance reforms. Daniel Vaughn remained largely silent, declining interviews, but ensuring continued legal support until her record was fully cleared. In a final pretrial hearing before formal indictment, proceedings advanced. The judge addressed the courtroom with measured clarity. This case demonstrates the severe consequences of abusing institutional authority for personal gain and attempting to conceal misconduct through fabricated evidence. The words landed heavily. Marcus's once immaculate composure had thinned into visible strain. The architecture of his scheme, designed to be seamless, had collapsed under the one factor he dismissed as irrelevant: Elena's presence in a room filled with witnesses and immutable timestamps. He thought he framed her perfectly. He calculated digital pathways, compliance triggers, and public perception. What he failed to calculate was that truth, when documented precisely enough, becomes immovable. And now, as formal trial dates were set and the possibility of a lengthy federal sentence loomed, the balance of power had shifted completely. The woman he tried to erase was about to testify, not as a defendant, but as the central witness in a case that would dismantle him. The indictment was swift and merciless. By the time Marcus Hale stood in federal court for arraignment, the narrative had fully inverted. No longer was he the composed executive offering cooperation in a fraud investigation. He was now the architect of one. The courtroom felt different this time. Reporters weren't whispering speculation. They were reading from documented filings. Wire fraud, aggravated identity misuse, obstruction of justice, perjury. Each charge carried weight on its own. Together, they threatened to bury him for decades. Marcus entered a plea of not guilty, his voice steady, but thinner than before. His legal team pivoted immediately toward a new strategy: shared culpability. If they could muddy the water, suggest Elena had discovered the siphoning and agreed to participate in exchange for silence, it might reduce intent from malicious framing to mutual conspiracy. It was a high-risk gamble. During preliminary hearings, Marcus's attorney implied that Elena's gala alibi had been strategically convenient. Isn't it interesting, he argued, that the defendant chose a high-profile public event the very night internal transfers occurred? The insinuation was clear. Perhaps she anticipated scrutiny. Elena's attorney objected sharply. Daniel Vaughn, seated behind them, remained motionless but observant. When it was Elena's turn to testify in rebuttal, the courtroom tightened with anticipation. She walked to the stand calmly, aware that millions had seen her in handcuffs, but far fewer had heard her speak. Under oath, she detailed her audit findings leading up to that week: minor inconsistencies in reserve reallocations, repeated vendor IDs, timing clusters just before reporting deadlines. She explained her request for archived logs and the tension she sensed afterward. Then Vaughn's attorney introduced email records. At 6:12 p.m. on the night of the gala, Elena had forwarded Marcus a reminder about reviewing the reserve discrepancies Monday morning. At 8:58 p.m., Marcus received compliance alerts tied to her archive request. At 9:12 p.m., his car entered the parking garage. The sequence unfolded on screen like a controlled detonation. The defense's suggestion of collusion collapsed under chronological clarity. There was no communication between Elena and Marcus that night beyond that early email. No encrypted exchanges. No financial benefit to her. In fact, her bank records showed stable balances and conservative investments. The prosecution ended the session by stating plainly, this was not partnership. This was preemption. Marcus avoided eye contact as he was escorted out. His attempt to drag Elena back into suspicion had only strengthened the case that he acted alone and acted quickly once he realized she was close to uncovering him. As trial preparation intensified, prosecutors shifted focus from digital evidence to psychology. Crimes of this scale are rarely just about money. They are about control. They brought in behavioral analysts to outline patterns common among executive fraud cases: incremental risk escalation, entitlement rationalization, and elimination of perceived threats. Marcus fit the profile with chilling precision. Over 2 years, he had tested the system in small amounts, confirming that oversight mechanisms were too diffuse to flag minor diversions. Each successful quarter emboldened him. The siphoned funds fed the shell startup, which in turn fed his belief that he could outmaneuver regulatory structures. Elena's audit request wasn't just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. It introduced unpredictability. During witness testimony, the head of IT described how executive override privileges were intentionally restricted and monitored because of their power. Only someone who understood both financial flow and network architecture could coordinate this level of manipulation, he stated. Prosecutors then displayed Marcus's background: dual degrees in finance and information systems. He wasn't guessing. He knew exactly where blind spots existed. Meanwhile, Elena faced a different battle outside the courtroom. Though charges against her were dropped, online archives preserved early headlines declaring her guilty. Prospective employers hesitated. Anonymous messages accused her of getting away with it because of a billionaire. Trauma doesn't evaporate with exoneration. It lingers in quiet moments. Daniel Vaughn met with her privately during this period. Truth doesn't trend as fast as scandal, he told her evenly, but it lasts longer. He offered support not as charity, but as strategic correction. Behind the scenes, his foundation began quietly funding an initiative focused on corporate whistleblower protections. The case was no longer isolated. It was emblematic. Back in court, encrypted email chains between Marcus and the offshore account administrators were decrypted. One line became pivotal: "She's closer than expected. Moving everything Saturday." The timestamp was 3 hours before the gala began. That single sentence destroyed any lingering narrative of coincidence. It revealed awareness, urgency, and motive in Marcus's own words. When the email was read aloud, the courtroom fell silent. Marcus stared straight ahead, but the rigidity in his posture betrayed strain. The prosecution rested that day with a simple statement: intent has been demonstrated. The defense entered its final phase with diminishing options. Without viable evidence of collusion or external hacking, they leaned heavily on reasonable doubt. They argued that while Marcus's actions appeared suspicious, suspicion did not equal proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They suggested the decrypted email lacked full context. They questioned forensic chain-of-custody procedures. It was methodical, but it lacked gravity compared to the layered documentation presented by the prosecution. Then came the moment that shifted everything from technical to human. Elena was recalled to describe the morning of her arrest. She spoke not of systems or timestamps, but of humiliation, of neighbors watching through curtains, of her parents receiving frantic calls from relatives overseas, of sitting in a holding cell wondering how evidence could fabricate reality so convincingly. "I believed data was objective," she said quietly. "I built my career on that belief. Watching it used against me felt like watching the ground disappear." Jurors listened differently now. This wasn't abstract finance. It was deliberate reputational execution. Prosecutors closed by reconstructing the timeline one final time: archive request, compliance alert, garage entry, console activation, fund transfer, offshore routing, anonymous tip submission, false testimony. Each step flowed into the next with mechanical precision. It wasn't chaotic theft. It was calculated removal of a threat. When Marcus took the stand in his own defense, it was a gamble. He denied malicious intent. He framed the siphoned funds as temporary reallocations meant to stabilize a private investment vehicle that would ultimately benefit the firm. He insisted panic led him to poor decisions once scrutiny increased. But under cross-examination, when asked why he used Elena's credentials instead of disclosing the investment to the board, he hesitated just long enough for the silence to stretch. "I made a mistake," he finally said. It was the first time he used language approaching admission. Not mistaken accounting. Mistaken judgment. The prosecution seized it. "A mistake," the attorney replied evenly, "that required fabricating digital evidence, lying under oath, and allowing an innocent employee to be arrested?" Marcus did not answer immediately. And in federal court, silence can be louder than confession. As closing arguments concluded and the jury prepared for deliberation, one reality was clear. The man who thought he engineered a flawless frame was now trapped inside his own meticulously constructed timeline. The same precision he relied on to destroy Elena had become the structure proving his intent. The verdict was approaching, and there was no system left for him to manipulate. Jury deliberations began on a Monday morning under a sky that threatened rain but never delivered it, as if even the weather was holding its breath. Inside the courthouse, Marcus Hale sat in a quiet consultation room with his attorneys, reviewing arguments that had already been made, searching for weaknesses that no longer seemed to exist. For the first time in years, he was not in control of timing. He could not accelerate a transfer, override a system, or reroute suspicion. 12 strangers now controlled his future. Across the building, Elena sat beside her parents, hands clasped tightly enough to whiten her knuckles. She had prepared herself for every possible outcome, but uncertainty is its own punishment. Reporters filled the hallway, whispering about precedent and corporate governance reform. Legal analysts on television debated how digital forensics had reshaped white-collar prosecutions. Hours passed. The jury requested clarification on 2 points: the timeline alignment between the garage footage and the console activation, and the decrypted email referencing, moving everything Saturday. The judge reread the relevant testimony. That request signaled something critical. They were not confused about Elena. They were scrutinizing Marcus's intent. In the consultation room, Marcus's lead attorney attempted reassurance. "Questions mean they're thorough. Thorough can favor us." But Marcus understood subtext. Thorough meant they were building internal consensus. By late afternoon, a note was delivered to the judge. A verdict had been reached. The courtroom filled quickly, tension tightening every breath. Marcus entered first, shoulders squared, expression disciplined. Elena followed, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the shuffle of chairs. The foreperson stood when prompted. "On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The word landed with a finality that seemed to echo. "On the charge of embezzlement, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of perjury, guilty." Each count stacked heavier than the last. Marcus remained still, but the faint tremor in his jaw betrayed him. Elena closed her eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in release. The system that had nearly crushed her had corrected itself. The judge thanked the jury and scheduled sentencing. Outside, the news broke within seconds. Headlines shifted from allegation to conviction. Commentators called it a landmark example of insider threat prosecution. But inside the courtroom, the moment was quieter than the coverage would ever convey. Justice rarely roars. It settles. As Marcus was escorted out, he glanced back once, not at the jury, not at the cameras, but at Elena. There was no apology in his eyes. Only the dawning realization that the architecture he trusted had turned against him completely. Sentencing hearings are less dramatic than verdicts, but often more revealing. Over the following weeks, federal prosecutors compiled impact statements, financial loss assessments, and psychological evaluations. The total misappropriated funds exceeded $30 million, though a portion had been frozen before full dissipation. The firm's valuation had dropped temporarily after public exposure. Employees described instability and reputational harm. Elena submitted a written victim impact statement, but chose to deliver it in person. When the day arrived, the courtroom atmosphere felt heavier than during trial. Conviction establishes guilt. Sentencing defines consequence. Prosecutors recommended a significant federal term, citing calculated intent, abuse of executive authority, and deliberate framing of an innocent employee. Marcus's defense argued for leniency, emphasizing his previously clean record, philanthropic donations, and claim that panic, not malice, drove his decision to implicate Elena.
Panic.
The word resurfaced like a weak shield. When Elena approached the podium, the room stilled. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize. "What happened to me was not a byproduct of panic," she said steadily. "It was a strategy. My credentials were used to construct a narrative. My reputation became collateral to protect someone else's ambition."
She
described sitting in a holding cell replaying every keystroke she had made in the weeks prior, questioning her own memory because the digital evidence seemed undeniable. "The most damaging part was not the arrest," she continued. "It was watching people assume the evidence must be right." Her statement reframed the crime. This was not just theft. It was weaponized credibility. When Marcus was given the opportunity to speak, he stood slowly. For a moment, it seemed he might finally express remorse directed at Elena specifically. Instead, he apologized broadly to the court, to the company, to his family. He referred to errors in judgment and escalating pressure. He did not say her name. The judge listened without interruption. Then, in a measured tone, she delivered the sentence: 17 years in federal prison, restitution orders, and permanent prohibition from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. The number settled over the room with undeniable weight. 17 years. Not symbolic. Substantial. As Marcus was led away, the transformation was complete. The executive, who once controlled multi-million-dollar flows, was now subject to institutional routine he could not influence. Elena remained seated for several seconds after adjournment, absorbing the finality. Justice had taken time, resources, and the intervention of a billionaire unwilling to ignore inconsistency. But it had arrived. After sentencing, silence replaced spectacle. Media cycles moved on to newer scandals, but the consequences lingered in quieter spaces. Harlow and Pierce implemented sweeping governance reforms, segregated override privileges, mandatory multi-party authorization for reserve transfers, independent cybersecurity audits. Elena was offered reinstatement with a promotion and public apology. The board wanted symbolic repair. She declined. Returning would mean walking daily through hallways where whispers once followed her. Instead, she met with Daniel Vaughn in a modest conference room overlooking the city skyline. He had kept his involvement strategic and largely private, but his presence had altered the trajectory of the case. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. It was not a patronizing question. It was an open one. Elena had spent weeks considering that answer. "I want to make it harder for this to happen to someone else," she replied. With Vaughn's backing, not as charity but as investment, she began designing a consultancy focused on forensic transparency and whistleblower protection within financial institutions. The irony was sharp. The same expertise Marcus exploited would now be used to detect exploitation earlier. Early interviews were cautious. Some viewed her as courageous. Others still associated her name with scandal. Rebuilding reputation is not instantaneous. It requires consistency. She accepted speaking invitations at universities, discussing how digital evidence can be manipulated internally and why layered verification matters. One clip from a keynote address began circulating online. "Data is powerful," she said in the recording. "But power without accountability becomes distortion. Truth requires context." The video resonated. Not because of drama, but because it reflected lived experience. Meanwhile, from a federal correctional facility, Marcus watched fragments of coverage through limited broadcasts. The startup he once funneled money into dissolved under asset seizure. Associates distanced themselves. Influence evaporated. Systems he believed he mastered continued functioning without him. Elena's consultancy secured its first major contract auditing governance structures for a regional bank. The symbolism was quiet but profound. The woman nearly erased by fabricated evidence was now strengthening the very systems that once failed her. The story that began with handcuffs did not end with a verdict. It evolved into recalibration of policy, of perception, of personal direction. Marcus had believed precision could guarantee immunity. Elena learned that resilience paired with truth could outlast manipulation. And as her work expanded, one principle remained central. Evidence should illuminate reality, not be engineered to replace it. The first major contract Elena's consultancy secured was not glamorous. It was a mid-sized regional bank with outdated internal controls and a board quietly terrified of becoming the next headline. But to Elena, it was proof of traction. She assembled a small team of forensic analysts, ethical hackers, and compliance attorneys, people who understood both finance and infrastructure. The goal was simple but ambitious: design systems where no single executive could weaponize authority the way Marcus had. Multi-layer authentication would require cross-department validation. Override consoles would trigger automatic third-party alerts. Audit requests from analysts could not be flagged silently to the very executives being audited. Structural sunlight. During the first on-site review, Elena walked through server rooms and executive floors with calm precision. She noticed subtle cultural patterns, the deference given to senior leadership, the hesitation of junior analysts to escalate concerns. Technology alone wasn't enough. Governance required courage embedded into policy. Meanwhile, the viral clip of her keynote continued circulating online. "Truth requires context" became a quoted phrase in business articles and leadership forums. Invitations multiplied. Some accused her of capitalizing on scandal. She understood the criticism but recognized something deeper. Narrative shapes reform. If her story forced institutions to confront vulnerability, then visibility was leverage. Across the country, Marcus adjusted to federal prison routine. The structure was rigid: count times, assigned duties, limited privileges. For a man accustomed to dictating outcomes, the loss of agency was suffocating. He followed financial news obsessively through permitted publications. When he read about Elena's consultancy expansion, a flicker of resentment surfaced, followed quickly by recognition. She had converted damage into direction. In contrast, his own name had become a cautionary case study in corporate ethics seminars. The irony was sharp. In one televised panel discussion, a cybersecurity expert dissected the original timeline again: garage entry, console activation, transfer sequence. The case was now textbook material. Marcus had believed he was sophisticated. In retrospect, the scheme appeared almost predictable in its psychology. Back at the bank audit, Elena uncovered a vulnerability eerily similar to the one Marcus exploited: an executive-level console that logged activity locally, but not externally. When she presented the risk assessment to the board, she spoke plainly. "Controls are not about distrust," she explained. "They are about protecting everyone, including leadership, from catastrophic temptation." The board approved immediate reform. That evening, standing alone in her office, Elena reflected on the arc of the past year. From handcuffs to policy architect. From defendant to advisor. Justice had punished Marcus, but prevention, that was her responsibility now. And prevention required relentless attention to detail. Public interest in the case reignited when a documentary streaming platform announced a feature on insider threats in corporate America, using Elena's experience as a central narrative thread. She hesitated before agreeing. Exposure once nearly destroyed her. But transparency, she had learned, could also dismantle stigma. During filming, she revisited the courthouse steps where she had first faced cameras as an accused criminal. The memory was visceral: the flashbulbs, the assumptions in reporters' voices. The hardest part wasn't the charges, she admitted on camera. It was watching people trust the system so completely that they stopped questioning whether it could be manipulated. The documentary juxtaposed her footage with expert analysis of digital credential spoofing and executive override abuse. It also included a segment on the importance of immutable timestamping technology, the very feature that had anchored her alibi. Daniel Vaughn agreed to a brief interview, characteristically controlled. "Systems are only as ethical as the people configuring them," he said. "Accountability must be engineered, not assumed." The release sparked renewed debate online about corporate transparency and executive oversight. Universities incorporated the case into ethics curricula. Elena began receiving messages from analysts across industries describing subtle irregularities they were afraid to escalate. The pattern was familiar: fear of retaliation, fear of isolation. She responded to as many as she could, connecting them with legal resources and governance frameworks. Meanwhile, in prison, Marcus watched a limited broadcast clip from the documentary during a scheduled media hour. Seeing his own actions dissected publicly, not sensationalized, but methodically explained, forced confrontation. There was no longer ambiguity, no alternative narrative, just sequence and consequence. He requested access to business ethics books from the prison library, though whether from introspection or restlessness even, he couldn't fully determine. Elena's consultancy expanded into 3 states, advising not only banks but healthcare networks and tech firms. Each contract reinforced the same principle: decentralize power, document transparently, and ensure no audit request alerts the subject of investigation. Her team coined an internal phrase: engineered accountability. It became their standard. And quietly, without spectacle, the reforms she advocated began reducing executive override vulnerabilities across multiple institutions. 2 years after the arrest that had nearly erased her career, Elena stood backstage at a national financial governance summit attended by regulators, executives, and policymakers. The event hall was filled with people who once might have dismissed her as collateral damage in a corporate scandal. Now, they introduced her as a reform strategist. When she stepped onto the stage, applause rose, not thunderous, but sustained. She began not with accusation, but with structure. She walked the audience through a simplified reconstruction of the exploit Marcus used: privileged access concentration, isolated logging systems, delayed compliance triggers. Then she outlined corrective architecture, distributed authorization, real-time cross-verification, independent forensic auditing. The presentation was technical, deliberate, actionable. Halfway through, she paused. "What happened to me was preventable," she said evenly. "Not because I had a billionaire at a gala. That was circumstance. It was preventable because no system should allow one individual to redirect funds and fabricate attribution without immediate external visibility." The room absorbed the statement. It reframed her story away from dramatic rescue and towards structural responsibility. After the keynote, regulators approached her about contributing to updated federal compliance guidelines. The transformation was complete, not celebrity, but authority. Later that evening, alone in her hotel room overlooking the city, Elena allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. The journey had not been clean. It had been humiliating, exhausting, destabilizing. But it had also clarified something fundamental: integrity without infrastructure is fragile. Across the country, Marcus marked another quiet day off his sentence calendar. 17 years is measured in slow increments. News about regulatory updates reached even prison periodicals. He recognized pieces of his own downfall embedded in new compliance language. The systems were evolving specifically to prevent someone like him from succeeding again. The thought carried an unfamiliar weight, not anger, not quite regret, but awareness. Elena closed her laptop and looked out at the skyline. The city lights flickered like a network of signals, millions of transactions, decisions, permissions flowing invisibly every second. Systems would always carry risk. Ambition would always test boundaries. But now, layered within those networks, were safeguards shaped by lived experience. He thought he framed her perfectly. Instead, his attempt became the blueprint that fortified the very structures he once exploited. And in that reversal, the final balance of power quietly, permanently shifted. The final chapter of the legal process did not unfold in a courtroom packed with cameras. It happened in quiet filings, restitution hearings, compliance reviews, and long-term consequences that stretched far beyond a headline. 2.5 years after Marcus Hale's conviction, federal auditors completed the final asset recovery report. Of the $30 million siphoned over 2 years, nearly $22 million had been recovered through seized accounts, liquidated holdings, and forced divestments. The remainder was classified as unrecoverable loss, absorbed by insurance, investors, and time. Harlow and Pierce had stabilized. New leadership implemented structural transparency measures modeled partly after Elena's consultancy framework. Ironically, her firm was hired as an independent reviewer during the company's final compliance certification. Walking back into the building where she had once been handcuffed was not dramatic. It was deliberate. Employees who had witnessed her arrest now greeted her with professional respect. No whispers. No speculation. Just acknowledgement. She reviewed server access hierarchies, override protocols, and cross-verification systems. Every vulnerability Marcus had exploited was now layered with oversight. Dual authorization tokens. Real-time third-party logging. Automated anomaly escalation that bypassed internal suppression. Structural memory had replaced blind trust. After the audit presentation, the board chair approached her privately. "We failed you," he said simply. Elena considered the statement. "The system failed," she replied. "But systems can be rebuilt." That distinction mattered. Across the country, Marcus's appeals process quietly concluded. His legal team had attempted to challenge evidentiary interpretations, arguing digital timestamp alignment could not prove singular physical presence beyond doubt, but appellate judges upheld the conviction unanimously. The opinion was direct. The evidence demonstrated calculated intent supported by synchronized physical and digital records. With that ruling, the legal path narrowed permanently. 17 years remained 17 years. Inside the correctional facility, Marcus adjusted to the permanence of it. Early resentment had eroded into routine. He worked in the prison library cataloging legal texts, an irony not lost on him. Occasionally, he would read appellate summaries referencing his own case as precedent. Words like abuse of authority and retaliatory fabrication followed his name clinically, without emotion. Outside those walls, Elena's consultancy expanded internationally. Regulatory agencies in 2 countries adopted variations of her accountability architecture guidelines. She trained compliance officers to recognize early indicators of executive-level manipulation, urgency spikes following audit requests, override clustering before reporting cycles, isolated logging systems vulnerable to suppression. During one advanced training seminar, a junior analyst raised a question. "What if leadership pressures us to ignore irregularities?" Elena paused before answering. "Document everything. Transparency protects you. Silence isolates you." It wasn't theory. It was lived instruction. That night, she received an email from a former employee of Marcus who had remained silent during the investigation. The message was brief. "I should have spoken sooner. I see that now." She didn't respond with blame. She responded with a resource link and a single sentence. "It's never too late to choose differently." Justice, she had learned, was not only punitive. It was corrective. And correction rippled outward long after sentencing gavel strikes faded. 5 years after the arrest that shattered her life, Elena stood on a different stage, this time at a global ethics summit streamed live to millions. The event title read, "Rebuilding Trust in the Age of Digital Power." She was no longer introduced as the analyst who was framed. She was introduced as a governance strategist whose framework had reshaped executive accountability standards across multiple sectors. As cameras went live, she began with a story, not dramatic, not embellished, just precise. "There was a night," she said evenly, "when digital records said I committed a crime at 9:47 p.m. At that exact minute, I was standing under stage lights giving a speech about accountability. The evidence against me was detailed, structured, convincing, and completely engineered." The audience was silent. "What saved me was not influence," she continued. "It was verification. Independent, synchronized, transparent verification." She walked through how concentration of authority creates fragility, how unchecked override privileges invite rationalization, how systems built on trust alone collapse under ambition. The livestream comment feed surged. Clips began trending in real time. One particular sentence resonated globally. "Power can manipulate data, but it cannot erase time." The phrase echoed across social media platforms within hours. Meanwhile, in a quiet prison common area, A small television mounted high on a wall replayed segments from the summit. Marcus happened to look up at the precise moment her closing line aired. There was no anger in his expression now. Only recognition. He had believed complexity was protection. He had believed digital sophistication guaranteed invisibility. He had believed framing her would secure his ascent. Instead, it accelerated his collapse. Elena closed her keynote with something unexpected. Accountability is not about punishment alone, she said. It's about designing systems where integrity is easier than corruption. The applause that followed was not explosive. It was sustained and deliberate, the kind reserved for ideas that feel durable. After the event, Daniel Vaughan sent a brief message. You built something permanent. She smiled faintly at the simplicity of it. Years earlier, he had preserved a timeline that saved her. Now she was helping preserve integrity at scale. The story that began with flashing cameras and handcuffs ended not with revenge, but with reform. Marcus thought he framed her perfectly. He calibrated access points, cloned credentials, engineered suspicion. But he overlooked one immutable variable. Truth anchored in time cannot be overwritten. And in the end, the billionaire alibi did more than destroy him. It illuminated a flaw in the system and gave the woman he tried to erase the platform to rebuild it stronger than before.